Berlin, spring 1941. The streets bustled with parades, flags fluttered in the cold wind, and loudspeakers blared triumphant speeches about Germany's new era. The young marched proudly, believing the fate of the world was being written by their hands. Among them, in white coats and eyes shining with idealism, was Hans Müller, a newly graduated doctor, his diploma still smelling of fresh ink. Hans didn't wield a rifle, but he did carry a case of medical instruments. He believed his role was noble, to save lives, to ease the pain of the wounded, to be a ray of humanity amid the storm of war. At that time, he truly believed he could cure the war. The city still didn't know the true price of blood. In the cafes, people spoke proudly of the swift victories in the West, Poland, France, Norway. It seemed nothing could stop the Wehrmacht. And now, a new campaign was about to begin. One the Führer promised would be swift and glorious. The invasion of the Soviet Union. Hans received his assignment with a racing heart. He would be a field medic for the 6th Infantry Division. On the morning of his departure, he donned his gray uniform, adjusted his helmet, and examined himself in the mirror. He saw a young, idealistic, clean-cut man, unaware that that reflection would be destroyed within a few months. His mother hugged him at the train station and with tears in her eyes said, "Save lives, my son. Do what is right, even when everything around you seems wrong." The train pulled. Away amid smoke and shouts of "Heil!" Soldiers laughed, exchanged cigarettes, and discussed how long it would take them to reach Moscow. Hans smiled, but inside there was a chill in his soul, a strange feeling, as if a shadow were watching him. In the train cars, doctors and nurses joked about who would attend to the first wounded, thinking that war would be like training, clean, quick, glorious. They didn't know what awaited them. None of them could imagine the smell of burning flesh, the sound of crunching bones, the horror of seeing a man begging for his life as blood gushed hot onto his hands. As he crossed the border, Hans looked out the window and saw the vast Russian horizon, endless, cold, hostile. The fields seemed endless, and the wind carried a strange melancholy. He believed he was setting out on a noble mission, bringing healing and compassion to the soldiers of the Reich. But the reality that awaited him was different, one that would transform every smile into trauma, every conviction into doubt, and every heartbeat into an invisible scar. Hans Müller didn't know it yet, but on that train journey, he wasn't going to save lives. He was going witness the collapse of humanity. Don't miss the next battle. Subscribe now. The sun had barely risen when the Wehrmacht columns began to move. It was June 1941. Operation Barbarossa had begun, the greatest invasion in human history. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched into the unknown, and among them was the young Dr. Hans Müller, riding on the back of a truck, clutching his instrument case tightly and looking out over the grey horizon of occupied Poland. The road seemed endless. Trucks laden with ammunition, dust-covered tanks, and exhausted soldiers formed an endless line. The rumble of iron tracks mingled with the drone of planes streaking across the sky, heralds of destruction. Hans watched it all with a mixture of fascination and unease. The ground trembled under the weight of the machines, and the air smelled of oil, smoke, and sweat. At first, the mood among the soldiers was euphoric. They sang patriotic marches, laughed, and mocked the enemy, who, they said, would be defeated in a few weeks. "Moscow before Christmas," they said confidently. Hans smiled, trying to believe it. At each stop, he tended to minor injuries, blisters on the feet, scrapes, mild fevers. It was the kind of pain he knew how to treat, but deep down, he felt it was just the silence before the storm. The days were long and suffocating. The Russian summer sun was beating down, and the dust from the roads seeped into everything, into his uniform, into his bread, into his lungs. At night, the cold came like a blade, cutting through the day's accumulated heat. Hans slept little, lulled by the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions. In his dreams, he saw faces he hadn't yet recognized, faces that would bleed before his hands. The landscape was beginning to change. Russian villages loomed like abandoned. Shadows, burnt-out houses, dry wells, wide-open doors. The silence was heavy, as if the ground itself were afraid. Whenever they encountered peasants, Hans noticed something unsettling. Their eyes, hard looks, full of hate and despair, as if they saw in the Germans not men, but demons. One morning, passing through a small village near Brest-Litovsk, Hans saw his first sign of true horror. A truck had hit a mine. Bodies lay scattered, chunks of metal and flesh mixed together on the road. He rushed to help, but the scene paralyzed him. The smell of burning blood, the moans of the dying, the sticky heat of blood seeping into his gloves, it all hit him like a brutal blow. While trying to save a soldier with his abdomen ripped open, he heard a sergeant shout, "Leave him alone! We have to move on!" Hans looked at the dying man. His eyes rolled back, his face covered in dust and fear. He knew that if he stayed there, he would die with him. And for the first time, he had to do something that would haunt him forever. Let someone die. On that endless road, Hans Müller began to understand. The glory he'd been promised was a golden lie. What existed, in truth, was a slow, inevitable march toward hell. A hell he would not only see, but experience, one wound at a time. The war was still in its infancy, but inside it, innocence was already over. The summer of 1941 was at its height when Hans Müller and his unit approached the front lines. The war, until then distant, became concrete, bloody, brutal and relentless. The young doctor would never forget the moment he crossed the battle line and came face to face with what the newspapers would never show, the true face of the front. Explosions shook the earth, raising clouds of dust and fragments of wood and metal. The smell of gunpowder, sweat and burning flesh filled the air. Soldiers screamed, the wounded and disoriented rolled on the ground, and the fury of the cannon seemed to pierce Hans's own heart. He ran back and forth, barely keeping up with the flow of wounded men, carried or dragged. Every scream was a silent plea for life. Every outstretched hand begged for help, and every fallen body whispered that death was inevitable. The first serious case arrived quickly. A young soldier, perhaps Hans's age, had his arm practically ripped off by an artillery shell. Blood gushed in a dark river, mixing with the wet, red earth. Hans felt his stomach churn, but he grabbed his tools and got to work. There was no time to hesitate. He stitched, staunched and pressed, his trembling hands trying to keep the life from escaping. The soldier groaned, his teeth clenched, his eyes fixed on the blue sky, indifferent to the pain, indifferent to the chaos around him. Minutes later, a shell hit the ground nearby, sending shrapnel flying that severed another comrade's leg. Hans ran to him, but as he approached, he realized the wound was too severe. He improvised, wrapping pieces of cloth around the wound and applying pressure, praying the young man would hold out until he could evacuate. But war doesn't always leave room for miracles. Some soldiers simply died there, before his eyes, and Hans could do nothing but watch the life slipping away through the flowing blood. The physical horror soon mixed with the psychological. Hans saw colleagues lose their composure, soldiers attacking each other in desperation, shouting the names of family members who weren't there. Hans's eyes met fear, pain, and death at every turn. He understood in that instant that war wasn't just about tactics and battles, but about a constant horror which corroded body and soul. When the day ended, Hans was exhausted, covered in blood and mud. He looked around and saw what he had never imagined. Dozens of bodies strewn about, some still alive begging, others already inert. Reality hit him like a cold blade. The glory he had imagined wearing the Wehrmacht uniform was an illusion. What existed was suffering, a tangible hell, where every moment could be the last. That night, sitting by the makeshift fire, Hans wrote in his diary, "Today I touched death with my hands. Today I realize that saving one man can mean letting others die. War is not heroism. War is blood, fear, and screams that never end. And so, Hans Müller entered the true heart of Russian hell, a place where innocence was shattered with every explosion and every open wound, and where human life seemed as fragile as the snow that was beginning to fall. Timidly over the devastated fields, step onto the front lines of history, subscribe. The summer heat gave way to cold, damp nights. Among the devastated trees and fields, what they called a field hospital appeared, a large tarp, flapping in the wind, improvised on rickety planks and stakes driven into the earth. Hans Müller entered it for the first time and found a universe of concentrated pain, a microcosm of hell that spread across the Russian front. Inside the tent, the smell was unbearable, a mixture of blood, burning flesh, sweat, urine, and dung. Men screamed, howled, and cried. Open wounds dripped into puddles of mud. Flies buzzed incessantly over the bloodied bodies. Hans barely had time to breathe before another soldier fell into his arms, his leg crushed by a tank that had run over them. Tools were few and far between. Rusty needles, bandages torn from uniforms, gauze that had been washed so many times it looked like old paper. But Hans didn't hesitate. He set to work without pause, cleaning wounds with cold water, removing shrapnel, trying to staunch bleeding with whatever he had at hand. Every cut, every suture, every effort was idle against death that was prowling around the tent. Around him, the scene repeated itself over and over again. One soldier lost an arm, another an eye. Screams mingled with shouted orders, and the roar of distant artillery made the tent shake as if it were alive. Hans felt for the first time that his hands were weapons. Against death, small and powerless, but weapons nonetheless. He worked for hours without rest, while blood seeped through his gloves and dripped onto the muddy ground. In a corner, two soldiers fought for the life of a third, both desperate, crying and cursing the war. Hans had to intervene, holding them back, trying to impose some order amidst the chaos. Each decision was agonizing. Who could he save first? Who would he let die? With each choice, he felt humanity slipping through his fingers. When night finally fell, and the screams faded to faint moans, Hans looked around. He counted dozens of wounded. Many had already died, and some of the survivors were barely breathing. He sat, exhausted, drenched in blood and sweat. Every muscle in his body ached, every thought heavy with images of pain. But there was still hope, small, almost invisible, but there. In that field hospital, Hans realized that war wasn't just battlefields, gunpowder and tanks. It was a test of human endurance, a test of limits that no medical textbook or class could prepare for. There, amidst blood and screams, he would learn that saving lives would be a heroic act, but that death would always be lurking, ready to claim what war did not spare. And so Hans Müller understood. The front was not a place of glory. It was a hell where every act of kindness and courage would be tested to the limit. Discover the secrets of World War II. Subscribe today. Autumn was slowly approaching, and with it, the harbinger of a relentless Russian winter. The muddy frontline roads began to harden under the increasing cold, turning into icy, treacherous trails. For Hans Müller and the Wehrmacht soldiers, nature had now become as deadly an enemy as the Soviet army. Mornings began with thick frost. Breath vapor froze in the air, forming white clouds around men's mouths. Every step on the snow-covered roads was a painful effort. Wet boots froze, fingers turned purple and numb. Hans no longer worried just about battle, wounds, but about the very survival of the human body in the cold. Freezing turned simple wounds into fatal ones. Infections appeared within hours. The field hospital, now more improvised than ever, faced nearly insurmountable challenges. Doctors improvised heaters with fuel cans, melted snow for water, and cut pieces of old uniforms for bandages. Hans began to perform emergency amputations, often without anesthesia, to prevent gangrene that advanced rapidly in the biting cold. Each operation, was a duel against time and against death that came silently. Soldiers who once complained of fevers and cuts now lay motionless, their eyes glazed, their skin blue from the cold. Hans held hands too cold to feel life, trying to revive hearts that seemed frozen. Often, the heavy silence of the morning was broken only by the screams of pain from those resisting and the orders shouted by officers desperate to hold the front line. The cold also affected morale. Men who once laughed and sang marches now murmured the names of their mothers and wives, spoke to imaginary ghosts and wept secretly. Hans watched, trying to maintain his sanity as human limits were tested daily. He knew that it wasn't just bullets that killed, but cold, hunger, and despair. On a particularly cruel day, Hans had to drag an unconscious soldier covered in snow into the tent. His frozen hands could barely hold the heavy body. The boy's breathing was slow, each heartbeat a cruel reminder of the fragility of life. Hans worked tirelessly, using what little human warmth he had, digging his fingers into wounds that threatened to necrotize, while the snow continued to fall, as if trying to erase everything from existence. In those weeks of frozen progress, Hans realized a brutal truth. War was not just about battles and strategies, but about pure and ruthless resistance, where nature joined forces with the enemy to test the strength of every man. Every survivor was a victory, every death a constant reminder that the Russian front was a place without mercy, where even blood seemed to freeze before touching the ground. And so the young doctor, who had left full of illusions, began to understand that glory was a lie. War showed its true face, a deadly cold, a silent terror, and a suffering that could not be cured by knowledge or courage alone. Epic history awaits. Click subscribe. Winter has finally arrived, and with it what the soldiers would call true white nightmare. The German army was at the gates of Moscow, but what had been muddy roads and icy fields had turned into an endless snowy desert, where every step was a near impossible effort. For Hans Müller, the Wehrmacht doctor, reality became increasingly cruel. It wasn't just the gunshots or grenades that killed. The intense cold killed silently, corroding flesh and hope. The landscape was covered in a thick layer of snow, broken only by the tracks of tanks and the footprints of exhausted soldiers. Every tree seemed a frozen specter, every abandoned house a reminder of the destruction left behind. Hans saw his comrades staggering like ghosts, their hands purple, noses dripping blood, lips cracked, and eyes glazed with exhaustion. The cold was an invisible blade, cutting through bones, skin, and even courage. The field hospital, once housed under a tarp, was now a tent nearly buried by snow. The makeshift fires barely managed to warm the room, and the medicines were frozen or unusable. Hans spent hours stitching wounds that froze. Before he could finish, tearing off scraps of old clothing for bandages and trying to keep the few survivors warm. Each soldier's breath was a white cloud in the frigid air, each groan of pain an echo in the frozen desert. The cold also brought devastating famine. Food rations were insufficient. The hard, cold, and damp bread barely sustained the energy of a body freezing inside and out. Many soldiers fainted on the roads, swallowed by the snow, while Hans fought to save whoever he could. Gangrene spread with terrifying speed, and he had to perform emergency amputations, often without anesthesia, while hands trembled and numb fingers barely responded. The troops' morale plummeted. Soldiers who had once shouted orders now murmured, wept, prayed, or simply stared at the white horizon as if the world had ended. Hans saw broken men, transformed into shadows of their former selves, losing their sanity under the weight of cold and hunger. Some refused help, others begged, and the doctor's every choice became a torture. Who to save first when everyone was on the brink of death? Amidst the snow, Hans found a young soldier, unconscious, his face covered in ice. He felt the boy's icy hand contract in his. He fought against his exhaustion, against the cold that washed over him in waves and managed to warm him, giving him back his breath, at least for a few minutes. Every small victory was temporary, every failure definitive. Hans Müller, who had arrived in Russia full of illusions of heroism, now walked through a country that seemed to punish all human endeavor. He began writing in his diary, each word imbued with hopelessness and stark reality. The cold chooses neither enemies nor friends. It devours everyone. Moscow is not a city. It is a white, silent, and infinite tomb. What was once a march was now pure survival. Each step forward required inhuman strength. Each act of care cost effort and patience. And each wounded person saved was a bitter reminder of how many could not be saved. Hans Müller's dream of glory was completely shattered. All that remained was to fight against the cold, against death, and against his own hopelessness. The bloody retreat, the winter of 1941 on the Eastern Front, was not just a merciless season. It was a living predator, an invisible and omnipresent enemy that reaped lives with the same cruel efficiency as Soviet rifles. Temperatures that plunged below 40 degrees Celsius turned the air into sharp blades, freezing lungs, numbing limbs and turning sweat into lethal ice. The snow, dense and relentless, accumulated in treacherous drifts, swallowing boots, tank wheels, and any vestige of hope. For the Wehrmacht, what had been a triumphant blitzkrieg in the summer now revealed itself as a death trap. The Red Army, reinforced by frost-hardened Siberian divisions, counterattacked with renewed fury, exploiting German disorganization. The orders to retreat came as an inexorable verdict from the High Command. The front cannot be held. Retreat to viable defensive positions. For Hans Müller, the young combat medic of the 6th Panzer Division and his comrades in arms, this meant not a strategic retreat, but the prelude to primordial chaos, mass abandonment, carnage, and a death march through a white hell. What had once been a confident advance, with motorized columns roaring across vast steppes and burning villages, now metamorphosed into a desperate rout. The roads, or what remained of them, were a carpet of frozen mud, strewn with debris, twisted carcasses of Panzerkampfwagen 3 trucks, abandoned Pak-38 cannons, burst ammunition crates, and half-buried bloodied uniforms. The air echoed with the constant wail of the Siberian wind, howling like lost souls, carrying the acrid stench of gunpowder, human excrement, and rotting flesh. Hans, 28 years old, and with eyes already scarred by sleepless nights, marched at the head of a column of about 500 men, reduced to fewer than 200 in a few weeks. His feet, wrapped in improvised rags over his holey boots, throbbed with frostbite. The torn gloves barely contained the fingers, black with incipient gangrene. Each breath was agony, the exhaled steam immediately freezing into icy whiskers on the upper lip. The wounded were the beating heart of this tragedy, hundreds of them, victims of ambushes, Katyusha artillery, and anti-tank mines, lay on makeshift sleds or simply collapsed in the snow, unable to continue. Many suffered wounds too severe to walk. Shrapnel embedded in open abdomens, improvised amputations without anesthesia, galloping pneumonia that turned coughs into frothy gushes of blood. Hans felt his heart contract like an icy fist as he contemplated them. Comrades like Corporal Fritz Lehmann, with whom he had shared stolen cigarettes and bawdy jokes in muddy trenches. Lieutenant Karl Becker, who had saved Hans from a machine gun burst in Smolensk. The young recruit, Otto, 19, whose mother had sent him a crumpled photo in her pocket. "Helft mir, Herr Doctor," they begged, their voices hoarse and broken, holding out skeletal hands. Leaving them behind meant a slow death sentence. The Soviets, when they found the abandoned, spared no bullets. They used bayonets or left them to the wolves and the cold. Hans knew, with the coldness of someone who had seen thousands die, that trying to carry them all would be collective suicide. Still, his humanity rebelled. With gritted teeth, he dragged the lightest ones by tow ropes, carried others on his hunched shoulders, wrapping them in tattered blankets stolen from slaughtered horses. The cold bit his fingers like red-hot pliers. The snow clung to the congealed blood and hardened mud, forming crusts that cracked with each stumbling step. Every meter was a superhuman effort, muscles burning in protest, vision blurred by frozen tears. The hellish symphony of the retreat was a sensory pandemonium that tore at sanity. The dry crack of ancient trees breaking under the weight of the snow mingled with the scattered cover fire of MG-42 machine guns, spitting futile fire against enemy shadows. The agonized screams of wounded men and animals pierced the air. Draft horses, eyes glazed with terror, whinnied as they were slaughtered to ease their suffering. Overloaded mules collapsed, their smoking entrails contrasting with the immaculate white. Panzer IV tanks bogged down in deep snow, tracks spinning in vain, crews emerging to be strafed or frozen in place. Explosions from landmines and mortar shells ripped through the frozen earth, sending geysers of snow and human fragments into the air. Severed arms, eviscerated torsos raining down like macabre confetti. Hans ran back and forth amid the chaos, a tireless demon. He staunched bleeding with snow-soaked bandages, injected morphine from frozen syringes that barely pierced the skin, amputated gangrenous limbs with dull bone saws. "Hold on tight! Breathe slowly!" he shouted, his hoarse voice competing with the tumult. Each decision was a blade to the soul. Save the sergeant with his guts hanging out, or the recruit with the punctured lung. Prioritize the officer or the family man. Hans's conscience bled as much as the arteries he tried to compress. Each choice was a verdict from God, and he a reluctant judge in a court of horrors. The climax of the inferno came in a devastating ambush at dusk on a sunless day. A column of 300 souls was surprised by a hail of Soviet RPG-40 grenades and 82mm mortars, the sky lighting up in red flashes like open wounds. The initial impact claimed dozens of lives. An Opel Blitz truck exploded in a fireball, consuming 15 men in howling flames. Another group was swept away by bursts of PPSH-41 submachine guns, spewing 900 rounds per minute. Hans, at the center of the pandemonium, surrounded by screaming wounded and survivors in blind panic, improvised with the ferocity of a cornered animal. He ripped canvas from torn tents to staunch abdominal wounds, fashioned leather belts into tourniquets that cut off circulation to the bone, and ripped sleeves from uniforms for pressure dressings. He even used empty cartridge belts as drainage for pneumothoraces, piercing chests with combat knives heated over a lighter. "Stay still, I'll get you out of here," he promised, though he knew it was a lie. In the men's eyes, he saw the abyss. The primal terror of the corporal who had lost his legs, the resigned despair of the lieutenant who muttered Catholic prayers. Between gulps of blood, the incipient madness of the recruit who laughed hysterically as he bled from the rectum. The smell was unbearable. Burned offal, fearful urine, infected pus, and Hans vomited icy bile between patients, wiping his mouth with his dirty sleeve. The cold, that merciless tyrant, showed no discrimination. General officers fell alongside recruits. Heroes of Stalingrad turned into ice statues before dawn. Soldiers fell on the march, paralyzed by frostbite, bodies stiff as logs, urine freezing in their pants into yellow crystals. Hans fought his own exhaustion. Hallucinations assailed him, visions of ghosts of past patients reaching out accusing hands. But he persisted, dragging inert bodies to snow shelters dug with rusty shovels. Slowly, a bitter truth crystallized in his mind. War was not the romantic clang of bayonets and heroic charges. It was a sadistic ritual of abandonment and primitive survival, where brotherhood dissolved into moral cannibalism. Sharing the last. Biscuit meant starving together. Sacrificing the weak saved the strong. Every step in the snow was Russian roulette. A deep footprint could be the grave of a mine, a gust of wind the harbinger of fatal hypothermia. After 12 endless days, an eternity of gnawing hunger, thirst slaked with dirty snow and sleep stolen from watchkeeping, the remaining column reached a makeshift supply line near Vyazma. Hans collapsed in a bloody snowdrift, exhausted to the core, his body a map of cuts, burns and bruises. With trembling, frozen hands, fingers throbbing like hammers, he counted the survivors. 87 men standing, 42 seriously wounded still breathing, 371 dead or abandoned. Each number was a piercing stab. Fritz, eviscerated by shrapnel, Karl, frozen with a petrified smile, Otto, left with a morphine injection and a thin blanket. Powerlessness crushed him like an avalanche. How many lives had he saved? How many had he doomed through human weakness? Cold tears streaked his bearded face as he opened the diary, its pages crumpled and blood-stained, and scribbled with a pencil stub. Today I carried the dead on my shoulders and left the living to suffer in the shadows. What is heroism when death decides for us, laughing at our despair? The Russian front is not a battlefield, but a cosmic slaughterhouse where God is absent and the devil commands the orchestra. I survived, but part of me died with each man I buried in the nameless snow. In that bloody retreat, the prelude to the Moscow catastrophe, where 300,000 Germans perished or were captured, Hans Müller understood irrevocably that glory was a Goebbels propaganda illusion. War offered no clean victories or spotless heroes. It offered only precarious survival, scars that festered for decades, and memories of horrors that no wine or psychoanalysis could erase. The Russian front was an alchemical laboratory of pain, transmuted into nihilism. Every action tested in the crucible of ice, every choice a sentence of life or damnation, every survivor a spectre bearing the weight of a collective tragedy impossible to forget. From then on, Hans would march not for Reich or Führer, but for the stubborn refusal to surrender to the void, a man forged in the white fire of eternal winter, the madness of men. The winter of 1941 on the Russian front was not just a massacre of flesh and blood. It was a slow crucifixion of the human mind, a relentless assault on sanity that transformed soldiers into specters of their former selves. As the Wehrmacht lurched between halting advances and chaotic retreats across the frozen fields of the Soviet Union, Hans Müller, the 28-year-old combat medic of the 6th Panzer Division, witnessed a destruction more insidious than the explosions of howitzers or the bursts of PPSH-41 machine guns. War, with its incessant symphony of death, hunger and cold, was not content with tearing apart bodies. It shattered souls, corroded minds, and stripped humanity from men who, months earlier, had marched with the arrogance of conquerors. The Eastern Front, with its white and sterile horizons, had become a vast open-air madhouse where madness was not the exception, but the rule. Hans saw the signs with harrowing clarity. Soldiers who had once displayed Prussian discipline, backs erect, orders carried out precisely, now disintegrated into unrecognizable fragments. Men murmured to themselves, conversing with invisible shadows, their hoarse voices mingling with the howl of the Siberian wind. Some stared blankly into space, their eyes glazed over as if seeing beyond reality, perhaps searching for a distant home or a god who seemed to have turned his back. Others, seized by a silent rage, tore their uniforms to shreds, tearing out pieces of fabric as if to undo their very existence. Most horrifying still were those who, in blind desperation, mutilated themselves. Hans found a corporal, Karl-Heinz, kneeling in the snow, bayoneting his own thigh, blood running in dark rivulets as he laughed, a hollow, joyless laugh. "It's better this way, Herr Doctor," Karl-Heinz murmured. "Better me than them." Others wandered aimlessly, oblivious to the crackle of tracer bullets or the boom of mortars, as if reality had fractured, leaving them trapped in a limbo of apathy and terror. The battlefield was a labyrinth of insanity, a macabre theater where every scene defied reason. Hans saw soldiers laughing hysterically as they crushed the skulls of their dead comrades with rifle butts, as if the destruction were a child's game. Others wept over frozen corpses, embracing them as if they were relatives, calling out the names of mothers, wives, or children who existed only in their shattered minds. Some simply froze, living statues in the snow, wide eyes fixed on horrors only they could see, unable to respond to orders or pleas. The cold, with temperatures that made the mercury in the thermometers recede in defeat, was a catalyst for this madness. Hunger gnawed at the insides, transforming men into animals that fought over crumbs of moldy bread or gnawed at boot leather in search of sustenance. The constant sound of death, the whistling of grenades, the thunder of T-34 tanks, the groan of abandoned wounded, reverberated like a hammer in the psyche, crushing any vestige of hope. Hans, running between makeshift trenches and snow shelters, felt less like a doctor and more like an archaeologist, excavating fragments of humanity amid psychological ruins. In the field, hospital, a tattered tent that stank of ether, coagulated blood and gangrene. The situation was a miniature nightmare. The canvas fluttered in gusts of wind, allowing snowflakes to invade the space and mingle with the blood on the packed earthen floor. The wounded, huddled on makeshift stretchers or directly on filthy blankets, were a mosaic of physical and mental suffering. Some refused help, tearing off soaked bandages with trembling fingers, screaming that they would rather die than endure the pain. Others tried to flee, dragging themselves on broken elbows, stumbling over the bodies of comrades who had already succumbed. Hans worked frantically under the flickering light of kerosene lamps. He stitched open wounds with suture thread, stiffened by the cold, amputated gangrenous limbs with dull sores, injected morphine into collapsed veins. Every gesture was a battle against time and decay, but he realized with bitter clarity that saving his body was not enough. His mind, that fragile castle, was crumbling under the weight of trauma. A young soldier, his face covered in powder burns, screamed that he saw demons dancing in the snow. Another, his legs crushed by a tank, whispered prayers in Latin, begging forgiveness for sins he didn't specify. Hans tried to calm them, but his words sounded hollow even to himself. How could one console someone who no longer recognized the world? One night, under a starless black sky, Hans witnessed the height of this madness. An 18-year-old, recruit Johann, a Mecklenburg boy, with the eyes of a frightened deer, succumbed to the pent-up terror. Chilled to the bone, starving, and with his feet wrapped in bloody rags, he began to scream, a primal sound that pierced the soul. "They're here! The Russians! The Russians!" he yelled, pointing into the darkness where there was only snow and silence. Before anyone could stop him, Johann attacked a wounded comrade, a sergeant with a bandaged abdomen, mistaking him for an enemy. He brandished a trench knife, his eyes wild, foaming at the lips like a hunted animal. Hans rushed forward, knocking over a table of surgical instruments, and grabbed Johann by the wrists, struggling to restrain him. "Johann, stop! It's us, your brothers!" he shouted as the boy struggled, convulsing as if possessed. It took 3 men to restrain him, tying him to a stretcher with leather belts. Even restrained, Johann continued to scream, calling for his mother, who had died years before, until a heavy dose of morphine knocked him out. Hans, panting, his heart racing, looked around. The other wounded watched in silence, some with frozen tears on their faces, others with blank expressions. In that tent, war revealed its cruelest face. It turned men into monsters not out of malice, but out of a despair so absolute that it dissolved the line between friend and foe, sanity and madness. Exhausted, Hans retreated to a corner of the tent, barely visible from the lantern light. Sitting on an empty ammunition box, he opened his diary, its pages yellowed and stained with dried blood. With trembling hands, the pencil nearly slipping from his fingers, stiffened by the cold, he wrote, "What scares most is not the bullets that pierce the chest, nor the wounds that gangrene under bandages. It is seeing men's souls shatter before you, fragment by fragment, with no chance of reconciliation or forgiveness. War is a grinder of minds, and I, a doctor of bodies, do not know how to heal what bleeds in. The soul. Each word was a silent scream against the helplessness that consumed him. Hans realized his own sanity was hanging by a thread. The sleepless nights, the fleeting hallucinations of dead faces, the weight of each life lost beneath his hands. He clung to the diary like a castaway to a wreck, trying to preserve a shred of rationality amidst the chaos. The Russian front was a war within a war, a psychological conflict where the invisible enemy, fear, despair, madness, was as lethal as any. Tank division, men who once marched proudly, chanting patriotic hymns beneath fluttering flags, now clung to fragmented memories, murmuring in dialects of pain only they understood. Some spoke to imaginary wives, others recited Goethe's verses as mantras against the void. Hans, driven by a stubborn instinct to preserve life, continued his fight, bandaging, suturing, consoling. But each act of care was also a battle against his own insanity, an attempt not to succumb to the same abyss that swallowed his comrades. In that cruel winter, Hans Müller, who had arrived in Russia with illusions of heroism forged by propaganda posters, understood the true face of war. It was not the glory of cavalry charges or the exaltation of victories in parades. It was a slaughterhouse of minds, a crematorium of hopes where humanity was reduced to rubble. He walked among broken men, bearing the burden of saving fragments of souls before they were lost forever in the eternal ice of the Eastern Front. Each life preserved was a Pyrrhic victory, a cry against the silence of an absent God, proof that even in the madness of men, there was still room for a doctor to try, against all odds, to keep the faint flame of humanity alive. The Stalingrad front. The autumn of 1942 brought Hans Müller, a combat medic in the 6th Panzer Division, to a scene beyond any conceivable nightmare. Stalingrad, the city that had become the epicenter of all-out war, a slaughterhouse where humanity was ground to dust. What had once been a vibrant industrial metropolis, pulsing with life along the banks of the Volga River, was now a smoking carcass, disfigured by Luftwaffe aerial bombardments and urban combat that turned every street into a mass grave. Once imposing buildings stood like twisted skeletons, their steel beams exposed and windows shattered. The streets, reduced to mazes of rubble, were paved with a grotesque mosaic of shattered concrete, charred wooden beams, pulverized bricks, and bodies. So many bodies, some still recognizable as human, others reduced to unrecognizable fragments. For Hans, the ground beneath his boots was no longer solid ground, but an unstable crust of congealed blood, metal shards, and human remains that crunched under each hesitant step. Stalingrad was not a city. It was a dying organism, reeking of death and roaring with the chaos of a battle that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Hans arrived at the front in September, when the German offensive still fueled. Illusions of a swift victory. But what he found was a hell of biblical proportions. The air was saturated with the acrid smell of gunpowder, burning flesh, and feces, a mixture that clung to the nostrils and permeated the uniforms. Descending the slippery steps of a basement converted into a makeshift hospital, Hans was engulfed in a suffocating gloom, lit only by kerosene lamps that flickered like candles on a macabre altar. The atmosphere was a symphony of moans, muffled screams, and the metallic clang of surgical instruments falling onto bloody trays. Wounded soldiers were dragged inside by exhausted comrades, their bodies displaying a gallery of horrors, fractured limbs hanging at impossible angles, abdomens pierced by shrapnel, faces disfigured by flamethrower burns, eyes gouged out by mine explosions. Hans worked in an almost automatic frenzy, his hands covered in other people's blood, dried in crusts that cracked with every movement. He stitched wounds with coarse sutures, amputated legs and arms with dull bone saws, and improvised dressings with rags ripped from torn uniforms. Medical supplies were scarce. Soaked bandages were reused, morphine was rationed drop by drop, and ether, used as an anesthetic, evaporated too quickly in the frigid air. Every operation was a race against the clock, with death lurking over his shoulder, ready to claim another victim. The urban battle in Stalingrad turned every corner into a death trap, every move a gamble with one's life. The combat was hand-to-hand, visceral and primitive. Germans and Soviets fought for meters of ground, sometimes for a single room in a ruined building. RPG-40 grenades exploded with bone-reverberating booms, sending shrapnel ripping through flesh and uniform with equal indifference. Bursts of PPSH-41 submachine guns sliced through the air, while snipers hidden on rooftops or in shattered windows picked off men with surgical precision. Hans ran through the rubble, hunched over to avoid tracer, bullets that streaked across the sky like red comets. He dragged unconscious soldiers to the relative safety of basements or trenches, his muscles burning under the weight of their inert bodies. With belts and scraps of torn fabric, he improvised tourniquets to staunch bleeding that gushed like fountains, the hot blood melting the surrounding snow. Every lost minute was a death sentence. An untreated abdominal wound led to sepsis within hours. A punctured lung killed within minutes. Hans shouted orders to his assistants, his hoarse voice competing with the roar of T-34 tanks and the collapse of bombed-out buildings. "Press here! Hold tight!" he yelled as he stuffed improvised gauze into chest cavities, trying to save men who already seemed like ghosts. The Stalingrad cold, though less brutal than the previous winter, was an omnipresent enemy. Temperatures ranged from 10 to 20 degrees Celsius, freezing fingers, noses, and hopes. Hans's hands felt numb, his fingers stiff as twigs, making every suture, every injection difficult. His boots, soaked with melted snow and blood, stuck to the ground, and the vapor from his breath formed ice crystals in his sparse beard. The cold didn't just kill through hypothermia, it amplified hypovolemic shock, hastening the death of soldiers who might have survived under better conditions. Many of the wounded Hans treated succumbed not to bullets or shrapnel, but to their bodies collapsing under the weight of exhaustion, malnutrition, and the relentless cold. He had to make split-second decisions. Who had a chance of surviving with improvised surgery? Who should receive the last vial of morphine to die painlessly? Each choice was a crushing weight, a knife to the conscience. He looked into the eyes of men, some 17-year-old boys, others hardened veterans, and saw the same desperation, the same silent plea for a salvation he couldn't always offer. Inside the basement hospital, the chaos was even more claustrophobic. The narrow corridors, lit by candles and lanterns, were crammed with makeshift stretchers made from ripped-out doors and threadbare blankets. The air stank of gangrene, urine, and fear, a smell that seeped into the soul. Soldiers muttered wildly, some caught in feverish delirium, calling for mothers or lovers they would never see again. Others screamed in agony, their bodies convulsing as gangrene devoured limbs already lost. Hans saw in each face a story of unspeakable suffering. The lieutenant with his jaw shattered by a grenade, gurgling blood as he tried to speak. The recruit with his legs crushed by rubble, begging not to be abandoned. The sergeant blinded by an explosion, groping for a hand that would not come. Some soldiers, overcome by the madness of combat, tore off their own bandages, tearing freshly stitched wounds in a self-destructive frenzy. Hans had to restrain them, sometimes physically, tying them to the stretchers with makeshift ropes. He worked to the brink of exhaustion, his eyes burning from smoke and sleep deprivation, his mind wavering between duty and despair. There was no time for mourning or reflection, only the next wounded man, the next scream, the next life hanging by a thread. Outside the basement, Stalingrad was an endless battlefield, a monster devouring lives with insatiable hunger. The streets, or what remained of them, were corridors of death, where every step could be your last. Buildings collapsed with earth-shaking booms, burying soldiers trying to cross them. German and Soviet tanks dueled in devastated squares, their explosions lighting up the night sky like macabre fireworks. Soviet partisans, hidden in sewers and ruins, ambushed patrols with knives and homemade grenades. Hans, rescuing wounded men under fire, felt his heart racing, his body driven by a mixture of adrenaline and instinct. Each run was a deadly dance. He threw himself to the ground to avoid volleys, crawled through rubble to reach a fallen soldier, dragged heavy bodies. As bullets buzzed like enraged wasps, during one such rescue, a grenade exploded a few meters away, the impact throwing him against a brick wall. Dazed, with his ears ringing and blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, he continued, pulling an unconscious corporal to safety from a crater. "Hold on, man, hold on," he muttered, more to himself than to the soldier. In the solitude of a rare respite, Hans sat among the rubble, his diary open on his knees, his trembling hands staining the pages. With blood and soot, by the dim light of a candle, he wrote, "I never imagined that man could destroy himself so much. Every street, every corner, every house carries blood, screams and terror. Here, saving a life is a miracle, losing one is inevitable. Stalingrad is not a battle, it is an apocalypse, and I am just a man trying to put out a fire with his bare hands." Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was a testament to human horror, a crucible where courage, despair and madness fused into a single indistinct substance. Hans Müller, who had left Germany with naive dreams of heroism, now found himself trapped at the epicenter of a hell where each day was a struggle to keep those who still breathed alive. He worked beyond human limits, defying cold, hunger, and the imminent collapse of his own sanity. Death lurked around every shadow, every corner, waiting for the slightest oversight to claim another soul. And yet, Hans persisted, driven by a sense of duty that bordered on the sacred, a lone physician trying to preserve fragments of life amid the collapse of a city and an era. The collapse. The siege of Stalingrad closed like an iron grip, squeezing the survivors into a prison of ice, fire, and despair. For Wehrmacht, Dr. Hans Müller, each day became a struggle not just against war wounds, but against the lack of everything that sustained life: food, medicine, fuel, and hope. Supplies ran out quickly. Bandages, painkillers, morphine, everything disappeared. Hans improvised with torn pieces of cloth, turning old uniforms into tourniquets or bandages. Every open wound was a race against time and against gangrene, which advanced with deadly speed in the biting cold. He nursed men whose legs, arms, or eyes were destroyed, performing amputations without anesthesia when necessary, just to keep them alive a few more days. Hunger was a silent enemy. Desperate soldiers scavenged for anything edible: snow, tree bark, the remains of old rations. Hans saw men faint, in lines, too weak to fight back or even call for help. Those who still breathed had hollow eyes, as if their spirits had been drained by war and cold. Chaos gripped the makeshift hospital. Soldiers screamed, begged, and fought for space, for the little warmth or melted water Hans could offer. He tried to organize lines, prioritize the wounded, but the number of living and dying bodies far exceeded his capacity. Each decision was agonizing. Saving one meant another might die without assistance. The weight of responsibility nearly crushed him, as snow seeped into the tent and froze his already tired and bloodied fingers. Psychological collapse was also inevitable. Men wept silently in dark corners. Others screamed madly, threatening to attack those nearby. Hans, who once believed in order and discipline, had to contain the madness with physical force and harsh words, while treating wounds he had never imagined he would see. He began writing in his diary, "War is no longer a fight between armies. It is hunger, cold, and despair. All that remains is to survive while everything around you dies." Even with all the effort, Hans realized that could not save everyone. Soldiers who had begged for help minutes before simply succumbed. The ground was covered with bodies, some still moving, others motionless. The cold froze the screams, the snow covered the wounds, and the city that had once seemed strategic was now a white, silent tomb, interrupted only by the occasional gunshot and the crack of distant explosions. At that moment, Hans Müller fully understood that the war had been won. There was no glory, no victory, only the crushing weight of human suffering. Every wounded person he tried to save was a cruel reminder that hell didn't need cannons to exist. War and abandonment were enough, surrender and captivity. With Stalingrad completely encircled, the Wehrmacht's situation became untenable. What remained of the German soldiers was exhausted, hungry and sick. Hans Müller, exhausted physically and emotionally, now faced a new reality: surrender. There were no more supplies, no more strategies, no more hope of rescue. Each survivor walked in silence, dragging their feet through the blood-stained snow, their uniforms torn and their faces no longer human. Surrendering to Soviet forces, Hans and the few survivors were surrounded and disarmed. The sense of defeat was overwhelming. There were no heroes, only broken men, reduced to shadows of themselves, the relentless. Cold continued to reap bodies as prisoners were herded into trucks or marched to makeshift prison camps. Hans felt each step as if it carried the weight of all the deaths he had witnessed. In captivity, Hans saw the cruelest side of war: extreme hunger, disease, physical and psychological abuse. Prisoners were crammed into freezing warehouses, many unable to move, dying from cold or malnutrition. Hans tried to care for some, improvising medical care with whatever he could find: pieces of cloth, melted snow, anything that could keep someone alive for another day. Every effort, however, seemed futile in the face of the utter despair all around. Hans's mind, already weakened by the horror of the front and the collapse at Stalingrad, began to waver. He witnessed men go mad, screaming alone in the dark, attacking other prisoners, or silently succumbing to the cold. He wondered if he could maintain any sanity while trying to save lives that seemed destined for death. Among the survivors, Hans became a kind of anchor of humanity. He offered words, care, small gestures of compassion. Each soldier who survived was a temporary triumph against the devastation that surrounded them. But with each lost look or fallen body, he reminded them that war spares no one. Even those who escape the front continue to pay with pain, fear, and invisible scars. In his diary he wrote, "The war is over, but not for us. Survival is not victory. It is carrying forever the weight of what we saw, what we did, and what we could not save. Each day is a cruel reminder that humanity can endure, but the horror never leaves us." Hans Müller, the young doctor who had left Berlin full of idealism and glory, emerged from the Russian hell not as a hero, but as a survivor, forever marked by the physical and psychological horror he witnessed and carrying stories that no one would believe if they hadn't lived them. Surviving against all odds. In the Soviet prison camps, Hans Müller discovered that the battle did not end with surrender. There, the war continued, in silence and in the most cruel way, against cold, hunger, disease, and total abandonment. Each day was a struggle against invisible forces that reaped life with relentless patience. The barracks were overcrowded and freezing. Sick and starving soldiers huddled together, many barely able to lift their heads. Snow seeped through the cracks, and the wind pierced like a blade, freezing bones and flesh. Food was minimal, cruelly rationed: thin soup, stale bread, and frozen water. Hans watched the prisoners waste away, each succumbing to weakness or illness, and saw in each face the painful memory of Stalingrad. Despite the scarcity, Hans did not abandon his role as a doctor. He improvised bandages with scraps of clothing, melted snow to make clean water, and tried to warm the sick with small gestures of compassion: a shared blanket, a hand holding another, words of encouragement. Every life saved was a micro-miracle in the midst of disaster, and Hans knew that every gesture could mean the difference between life and death. The famine was insidious. Many men tried to steal, fight, or even give up on life. Hans saw soldiers fall before his eyes, unable to fight the cold or walk to their makeshift tent. Gangrene, typhus, and pneumonia devoured the weakest. Hans, even exhausted, spent every ounce of energy caring for them, stitching wounds, cleaning infections, and reviving hearts that had lost hope. Hans's psychology was also being tested to the limit. He felt that each survivor who left was a small personal defeat, and each new patient a reminder of humanity's constant failure in the face of suffering. Yet he persisted, determined not to let the horror completely erase the dignity of the men around him. As winter wore on, Hans began to realize that surviving was a battle in itself. Each day that passed was a silent victory against death, each act of care an act of resistance. He wrote in his diary, "Here, war has changed its form, but not its purpose. There are no cannons, no grenades, just hunger, cold, and pain. Survival is a daily struggle, and yet every life I manage to sustain is a flame I refuse to let go." Hans Müller, the idealistic doctor who had left Berlin full of illusions of glory, was now a man, shaped by suffering, resisting against all odds, carrying the memory of every death, every scream, and every wound he had witnessed in the hell of the Russian front. The return to humanity. After months in captivity, Hans Müller was finally released, but freedom didn't bring immediate relief. The outside world seemed strange, distant, almost unreal compared to white and bloody hell that he had left behind. Every step out of the frozen fields carried the memory of the screams, the blood, and the fear that had shaped his existence for so long. His body still bore physical and psychological scars. Hans limped, felt lingering pain from poorly treated wounds, and struggled to adjust to the heat of the sun that now gently burned his skin. But worst of all were the phantasmas du front. Every shadow reminded him of an explosion. Every clang of metal made him shudder, and the eyes of the survivors who crossed his path reminded him of the soldiers he had failed to save. Hans found solace only in the little things: a hot meal, a clean bed, the voices of people who didn't scream for help. Every act of mutual care between civilians and soldiers was a reminder that humanity could still exist, despite everything he had witnessed. He began to help other veterans, sharing experiences, teaching improvised medical care, and listening to stories of suffering, as if each word could ease some of the weight of horror he carried. The doctor learned that war destroys not only bodies, but also the soul, and that true courage is not in the battle, but in the persistence of living after it. He began writing his memoirs, not as a technical record of the war, but as an attempt to keep alive the memory of those who did not survive and to understand his own suffering. Hans understood that life would never be the same, but there was still room for hope. He learned to cherish every smile, every act of kindness, and every moment of peace. The scars would never disappear, but over time they transformed into silent symbols of resistance, memories of the hell he survived and the humanity that was still possible to preserve. In his diary, he wrote, "I have survived the cold, the death, and the madness, but it is life that challenges me now, learning to feel again, to care again, to trust again. That is the battle that continues." Hans Müller returned to the world not as the young idealist from Berlin, but as a man forged by horror, carrying with them stories of courage, suffering, and humanity, ready to teach the world the true price of war and the strength that lies in simply survive and persist. The lessons of hell. Hans Müller, scarred physically and psychologically by the Russian front, learned that war is not about heroism or glory, but about extreme suffering, impossible decisions, and a constant struggle for survival. He realized the power of resilience and compassion, even in the simplest gestures, and the importance of preserving the memory of those who didn't survive. His true courage was shown in caring for others and persisting in the face of chaos, transforming the experience of horror into lessons about human fragility and strength. The legacy of the Wehrmacht doctor. After the war, Hans returned to Germany carrying scars and traumatic memories, but also the resilient humanity that war could not destroy. He dedicated himself to telling stories, caring for the wounded, and helping veterans, becoming a guardian of the memories of those who died. His legacy was measured not by medals, but by lives saved, empathy, and quiet courage. Hans became a symbol of resilience and humanity, surviving the Russian hell and preserving the memory of those who perished at the front.